What's good, everyone? This is Artist of Truth, and welcome to another vlog entry, right? And on today's topic, I want to backpedal a little bit on the discussion of Don Lemon, right? Now, I understand a lot of people, friends, followers, and supporters of Don Lemon, um, are led to believe that um, he is not going to be held accountable and liable for his action. Here's the thing: you can't hide behind reporting or journalism when there is a clearly established act in place. Um, but here's the thing, right? This video is not to bash Don Lemon, but to potentially shed some light on that situation, right? And as I stated before, and I have been posting, and it seems like YouTube really doesn't, the algorithms do not align or even allow for my voice to be heard. Hey, it's either here or there. Some of you will hear it, and then some of you will start to think about what I'm sharing with you all. So earlier, not too long ago, I got this thought in my head, right? I got this thought in mind. The difference between a bank and a church. And I thought to myself, what is the difference between banks and churches? I mean, of course, the core purpose of each one is different, right? But then I had to jump out the shower and I did some quick research. First things first, in American history, Don Lemon is the first and only quote unquote journalist, reporter, or whatever he identifies himself as, the first one ever in history to go into a church and disrupt church services, right? Very, very, very interesting point because there's not another journalist or reporter who has ever done that. Interesting. But here's the thing. I thought about it. I was like, you know what, Phil? What is the real difference? Like, is there a difference between a church and the bank? Because you can walk into a church, you really don't need permission to enter the church and worship. No different than a bank. You don't necessarily need permission to go into a bank. I mean, you can walk into any bank and ask to open up an account. At the end of the day, those two entities are different by the core. But I learned they are very, very much similar. Very, very much similar. Astounding, right? Okay. Before I get into it and really start reading into it, let me just say, let me just give my 2 cents real quick. Again, I'm not a fan of Don Lemon. I don't knock Don Lemon for what he does, but as I stated before, Don Lemon knew what he was walking into with those protesters. He knew. He knew of the protest group, the pull up organization, or however they choose to identify themselves. He knew about them. First things first. Most journalists they're when it comes to a church, they will get permission before entering. I learned that. Yeah, they will get permission before entering. Don Lemon did not get permission before entering. And then the sad part about it is Don Lemon claims that he's quote unquote for black people, which I call that a crock of BS. I don't believe that. For the simple fact, he after he was arrested, he somewhat turned his back on those women, on those protesters. He really slick turned his back on them. He really kind of threw them under the bus. Was like, well, shoot, they were there doing what they were doing. I was just there reporting. And I found that two-faced. I find that two-faced. So once again, as I stated, I don't respect the actions of Don Lemon because historically there has not been a journalist or a reporter that has ever entered into a church and disrupt church service. Now I got that out of the way. Let me give you let me give you a brief rundown, right? And I want you all to listen very, very closely. Before I do that, think about this. When have you ever witnessed a bank robber be accompanied by a reporter or a journalist who just wanted to record and interview those working within the bank, whether they're employees or whether they're customers? When have you ever witnessed or even heard of a bank robber entering a bank? The reporter knew what the bank robber was there for, knew the bank robber's name, and proceeded to accompany the bank robber into the bank. You've never heard of that, right? I know that sounds totally and completely redundant, right? It's just like, Uncle Phil, you know that's crazy, right? Yeah, I know that's crazy. Just like it was crazy for a reporter to think that it was perfectly okay to go into a church and disrupt worship services. But yet, Don Lemon, he calls himself, I don't know what he is, a Catholic or, but anyway. So here's the thing, right? Let me read this off to you. So historical coverage versus disruptive entry. Most U.S. journalists have covered religious gatherings by seeking permission, reporting outside, or attending open events, but not by entering ongoing services to interview worshipers without consent. Without consent now. Now that quick tidbit is from the Freedom Forum, okay? The freedomforum.org. On the subject, can you protest inside or near a church? First Amendment analysis. All right. So next, let me give you an example. Journalists have reported on church events or interviewed clergy before or after services or covered community responses. Civil rights movement events at churches, but that's distinct from entering a worship service in progress to interview participants without permission. Number 3, historical protests inside churches, not journalistic. All right. Don, pay close attention. Anyone that's connected to Don, I believe you really need to hear this because you're not doing your research, sir. There have been notable protests by activists inside the U.S. churches, especially in the 1960s and 1980s. But these usually were activists, not journalists. ACT UP stopped the church protest at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City in 1989, disrupted Mass as AIDS activists shouted, blew whistles, laid down in aisles, but journalists covered that from the outside, not by entering to interview petitioners during service. Okay? Next, earlier activists and civil rights demonstrators have also disrupted church services historically. Kneel-ins, occupations of churches in the 1960s. But again, press coverage was largely outside or afterwards, not journalists entering to intervene worship mid-service. That tidbit comes from the journal.com on protests inside churches are unusual despite long history of civil disobedience in the United States. Okay. Next, here's something else that I wanted to share that really stood out to me. Let me go back. Let's see. Undercover reporting versus disruption. There are also examples of journalists going behind the scenes in religious settings like undercover reporting on a sect or a unification church practice. But these weren't interruptions of ongoing worship service. They were targeted investigations and typically involve consent or covert observation outside the act of worship. Now, on the subject of churches and banks having great similarities, right? Let's touch on this for a bit, right? So they're very much similar, and I get some people will say, well, hey, look, Uncle Phil, you're comparing apples to oranges, right? At the end of the day, there's still a fruit. Even though the core purpose of each one is different, they're very much similar. Here's why. So in a short answer, banks and churches are similar in some important ways, especially historically and structurally, but they serve different core purposes, right? So here's a breakdown. Very, very interesting. Number one, both are built on trust, right? Churches, people place faith in spiritual authority, doctrine, and moral guidance. Banks, people place trust in institution to safeguard value, honor promises, and keep records. If both trusts collapse, if the trust collapse, then both will end up collapsing, right? Let us proceed. Number two, both act as custodians. Churches historically held tithes, offerings, relics, birth, death, and marriage records. The banks hold money, assets, titles, transaction, and identity records. In medieval Europe, church treasuries function like early banks. Number three, both use symbolic language and ritual. The church rituals, confession, baptism, communion. Bank rituals, signatures, oath, notarization, acceptance, credit creation. Both rely on spoken and written declarations to create binding effects. Number four, both operate through a belief in an invisible system. Pay attention here. Religion is belief in God, heaven, sin, and salvation. Banking, belief in fiat currency, credit, interest, and future repayment. Neither gold nor paper has value without collective belief. Number five, both develop hierarchies. The church, you have your priest, bishop, cardinal, and your pope. In the bank, you have a teller, manager, executive, and central bank. The authority flows from the top down, not horizontal. Number 6, both shape behavior. Churches regulate moral, right and wrong. Banks regulate economics, creditworthiness, risk, and access. Each can reward obedience or punish deviation. Okay. Number 7, where they lost the way. Common critique. This is where many people feel both drifted. Accumulation of wealth and property. Institutional self-preservation over service. Power concentration. Distance from the people they claim to serve. Historically, churches moved from spiritual care to political power. Banks moved from safekeeping to debt-based control. And here are the key differences, right? Still important. Churches ideally serve the soul and moral order. Banks serve economic order and capital flow. One claims divine authority, the other claims legal authority. So bottom line, both institutions of belief, trust, record keeping, and control. When aligned with service, they uplift communities. When aligned with power and profit, they dominate them. Y'all heard what I said, right? So getting back to Don Lemon. And I hope a lot of people will understand that Don Lemon made a bad mistake. Even though I personally don't care for Don Lemon, at the end of the day, if he identifies himself as a African American, black male, whatever, I still wish he would have used greater intellect before stepping into that church. I wish he would have used greater awareness and at least done his research before stepping into that church, calling himself a journalist to be reporting on a protest, because at the end of the day, that FACE Act exists. And I don't care what anyone else feels about it. When it's established and it's on paper and it has been there, you can't just ignore it. You can't bypass it without just consequence. You can't. Don Lemon made a terrible choice. He's going to have to own up to that. And that's not by throwing a group of protesters. The head activist of the protest happens to be a black woman. And you see what he did. Suddenly he disassociated himself, with the protesters and what they were doing by stating, well, I'm just a journalist. I was just there reporting. It, to me, is no different than a man following a bank robber that he knows personally by name into a bank to interview the customers, the bank manager, teller, and executor in the bank, stating, well, I'm just a journalist. I was like, but everyone sees that you came in at the same time with that robber. So when they eventually track the robber down and they hold him accountable, you are now an accomplice. I said it before and I still stand on that. Don Lemon, you are an accomplice to a crime, and you believe that reporting as a, as a journalist of some sort, because I don't know who paid him to go in there and do that. But the fact you made the conscious decision to go in without doing thorough research about whether you can or cannot do certain things. Because here's the thing, Don Lemon, and to anyone else who believes that, my viewpoint is incorrect, there are consequences to your action. He didn't research. Let's just keep it 1,000 on that point. Don Lemon did not do his research. He fucked around and found out the hard way. There's nothing more that can be said about that. People like to dance around the facts. And some people don't even look into the facts because they feel like emotions have emotions trump what the facts are. Again, at no point in time in Don Lemon's history of journalism or reporting did this man ever enter into a church without consent, without permission, because you can't do that. There are protections there. And he's going to have to face those consequences, So, in closing, everyone, I encourage you all, do your research. It doesn't hurt to do research. You honestly, at this day and age, for some time, we as people, we can't always necessarily rely on social media, the news outlets, because we do understand a lot of news outlets do not cover everything that they should. There are certain things that they can cover, and there are certain things that they're obviously being told don't touch. Which that doesn't make them, it doesn't make the news outlet reliable source to go to. Social media doesn't either, because social media is also under control. Whether it's YouTube, TikTok, or other different entities. I know this firsthand. I learned it for myself. That certain things you're not going to be able to post. They will block you. They will be quick to calling things, it's misinformation, when there are valuable resources out there to support the claim. So on that note, remember everyone, Uncle Phil loves you. And tighten up, Don Lemon. As much as you dislike the current president, and I don't like him fully either. I did in the beginning, in different aspects. Here's the thing, before I wrap this up. I know a lot of people will say, oh, you like Trump. I was like, yeah, I like Trump. I don't like everything about Trump. I don't agree with everything about Trump. I don't. Especially when it comes to protecting another country and allowing your own, your own country that you are head and chief of to be milked from billions and billions of taxpayer dollars, from taxpayers to fund another country. I'm not even going to mention his name, but you know exactly who I'm talking about. And it's not just Ukraine by itself. So, I like Trump in a business sense. A lot of people would say, oh, he filed bankruptcy and this, that, and the fifth. I was like, okay. I was like, he still has his assets, though. Here's the key part that really resonated for me. When I realized that man wasn't paying taxes, right? I was offended. I was really upset. But then a little small voice in my head was like, so find out how come he's not paying taxes. What is it that he's actually doing to avoid paying taxes? And legally, he can bypass it. You know, there's a whole saying, if you can't beat them, join them, right? Find out the rules of the game and learn how to play it. If not, that's no one else's responsibility to show you the way. You have to find a way on your own. Remember, Oakfield loves you, baby.